What if a single, careless moment could ripple forward through time, bending the course of history itself? What if one act of dishonor, committed in private, quietly rewrote the destiny of nations, yet unborn? Ancient scripture whispers such a story, one that begins not with armies or empires, but with a tent, a father, and a son who chose exposure over mercy. The floodwaters had finally withdrawn. The violent roar of judgment was replaced by an unsettling silence. Noah stepped out of the ark onto damp, newborn ground, the world scrubbed clean of everything that had once been familiar. No cities, no crowds, no rivals, just wind, earth, and the cries of animals rediscovering freedom. 8 human beings stood at the edge of history: Noah and his wife, and their sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth with their wives. Humanity had been reduced to a single family, and the future of the world rested entirely on their shoulders. Then God spoke into that silence with blessing and command. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth again. This was not a suggestion, it was a mandate. The rainbow that later arched across the sky sealed a covenant, a divine promise that such destruction would never come again by water. Every future generation would look up at that bow in the clouds and remember that God keeps his word. Then life slowly began again. Noah, no longer a shipbuilder, became a farmer. He worked the soil with his hands, planting a vineyard that demanded patience and care. Years passed before the vow. When they finally did, Noah crushed the grapes and waited as the juice fermented into wine, powerful and dangerous in equal measure. One day, he drank too much. The righteous man who had walked with God for centuries collapsed in drunken vulnerability, uncovered and unconscious in his tent. That was the moment everything changed. Ham entered the tent and saw his father's shame. What he did next mattered more than what he saw. Instead of turning away, instead of covering his father, instead of protecting his dignity, Ham left the tent and told his brothers. A private failure became public gossip. Vulnerability became entertainment. Disrespect replaced compassion. Shem and Japheth reacted differently. Without a word, they took a garment, placed it across their shoulders, and walked backward into the tent, refusing even to look upon their father's nakedness. Awkward, slow, deliberate, they chose honor over ease. They covered Noah without seeing his shame, guarding his dignity when he could not guard it himself. When Noah awoke, clarity returned, and with it understanding. He knew what had happened. He felt the sting of betrayal, sharper because it came from his own son, the very one he had carried through the judgment of the flood. Yet when Noah spoke, he did not curse Ham directly. Instead, his words fell upon Ham's son, Canaan. The curse was prophetic, not impulsive, a declaration that this line would become a servant of servants to its brothers. In contrast, Shem and Japheth received blessings that would shape spiritual and geopolitical history for millennia. From Shem would come the knowledge of the true God, the covenant line, the seed of promise. From Japheth would come expansion and eventual inclusion in that spiritual inheritance. And from Ham, through Canaan, Cush, and Misraim, would arise civilizations marked by power, ambition, and repeated defiance of God. Ham's descendants spread quickly. Cush's line produced Nimrod, a man the scriptures single out as the first mighty ruler on earth. He was not merely a hunter of animals, but a hunter of men, a consolidator of power, a builder of the world's first post-flood empire. In the fertile plains of Shinar, Nimrod established the cities whose names would echo through history: Babel, Erech, Akkad. Civilization, centralized, under human authority, directly opposing God's command to spread across the earth. Canaan's descendants settled the most valuable land of all, the territory God would later promise to Abraham. They built fortified cities, controlled trade routes, and developed religious practices that sank into horrific darkness. Fertility gods demanded ritual prostitution. Moloch demanded children burned alive. What began as a curse spoken in a tent took form as entire cultures devoted to false worship and moral corruption. Bon's Misraim's line became Egypt, brilliant, powerful, and proud. Pyramids pierced the skyline. Pharaohs claimed divinity. Knowledge flourished, but truth was buried beneath idols. Egypt would one day enslave the descendants of Shem, turning God's chosen people into forced laborers beneath the same sun that shone on golden temples. Stunned as humanity multiplied, something remarkable still held them together. One language, one speech. Everyone understood everyone else. That unity, instead of leading to obedience, fueled rebellion. In Shinar, heart of Nimrod's domain, people settled deliberately, refusing to scatter. They baked bricks, mixed tar, and planned a city crowned by a tower reaching toward heaven. Their goal was clear: make a name for themselves and prevent dispersion. Human pride stacked brick upon brick. God saw it all. He came down, not because he lacked perspective, but because he intended intervention. Unified rebellion, he declared, had no limits. So he shattered the one thing that made it possible. Language fractured. Words became noise. Cooperation dissolved into confusion. The tower was abandoned mid-ambition, and humanity scattered across the earth, forced at last to do what it had refused to do willingly. Tower of Babel became the birthplace of nations and the grave of human self-glory. Banned from that scattering emerged peoples, languages, and cultures, many of them tracing back to Ham's line. Again and again, those nations would rise against the covenant people. Egypt would enslave. Canaan would resist. Assyria would conquer. Babylon would destroy, and the pattern repeated with chilling consistency, all echoing back to dishonor in a tent and defiance on a plain. Yet, even here, the story is not finished. Division was not God's final word. Scattering was not the endgame. What Babel shattered, God would one day begin to heal, not through towers of pride, but through humility, sacrifice, and a promise still unfolding, a promise spoken quietly into a divided world. After Babel, humanity moved forward, fractured but purposeful, unaware that dispersion itself was part of a larger design. God had scattered the nations, but he had not abandoned them. From the broken languages, he was already selecting one thread that would be woven back through the whole tapestry of history. Tough at Babel. Out of the nations born at Babel, God reached into the land of Shinar once more and called a man named Abram. Abram did not build towers. He built altars. He did not seek a name for himself. God promised to make his name great. Where the builders of Babel said, "Let us make a name," God said to Abram, "I will bless you, and through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." The rebellion of Babel was answered by the obedience of one man who left his homeland, his language group, his gods, and his security behind, trusting a voice he could not see. That promise ran straight through the divided world. Babel created. Nations that could no longer understand each other would one day be blessed through Abram's seed. Languages born in judgment would one day hear good news. The curse that had echoed from Noah's tent would not have the final word. Still, the conflict continued. Abram's descendants grew into a people, and famine drove them south, right back into the shadow of Misraim's legacy. Egypt welcomed them at first, then enslaved them. The sons of Shem bent beneath the whips of Ham's descendants, just as Noah's words had foretold. For 400 years, the curse played out in brick pits and forced labor, Israel crying out beneath a sun that shone on temples to false gods. Banned, but God remembered his covenant. He shattered Egypt's power with signs and wonders, humiliating its gods one by one. The Nile turned to blood. Darkness swallowed the sun god Ra. Pharaoh, who claimed divinity, was broken by the hand of the true God. Israel walked out free, carrying the bones of Joseph and the promise of a land already occupied, Canaan. And there the ancient tension tightened. The land promised to Abraham was filled with fortified cities, giant warriors, and deeply rooted cultures. The descendants of Canaan did not surrender quietly. Jericho's walls loomed, altars to Baal smoked on hilltops. The curse had matured into resistance, and the conquest would demand obedience, faith, and relentless dependence on God. When Israel compromised, when they adopted Canaanite practices instead of destroying them, the land vomited corruption back into their own hearts. The very sins God warned them against became snares again and again. Centuries passed, and the pattern refused to break. Bandy from the north came Assyria, rising from cities first built under Nimrod's shadow. They crushed Israel and scattered the 10 tribes. From the east came Babylon, heir to Babel's ambition, carrying Judah into exile after burning Jerusalem and leveling the temple. Empires rose, conquered, and fell, but they all shared the same heartbeat: centralized power, human glory, false worship, and defiance of heaven. Yet even in exile, the promise lived. Commander prophets spoke of a kingdom not built with bricks or towers, a ruler not crowned by conquest, a restoration not achieved by force. They spoke of a servant who would reverse curses instead of enforcing them, who would gather nations instead of scattering them, who would speak peace into every language born at Babel. Then, in the fullness of time he came, not in Shinar, not in Egypt, not in Babylon. He came through the line of Shem, in the house of David, born not in a palace, but in a stable. He did not climb towers to reach heaven. Heaven came down to him. He did not make a name for himself. He humbled himself to death. And when he spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. Mandian at Pentecost. People from every nation under heaven gathered in Jerusalem. Parthians, Medes, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Cretans, Arabs, descendants of Babel, speakers of shattered tongues. The Spirit descended, and suddenly the curse reversed itself. They heard one message in many languages, each understanding clearly. Babel's confusion met Pentecost's clarity. Scattering met gathering. Judgment met grace. Dent what human pride broke, divine mercy began to heal. Mend the story that began in a vineyard, passed through a tower, and echoed through empires, did not end in domination or revenge. It moved toward The curse spoken in Noah's tent revealed the depth of human rebellion, but the promise spoken to Abraham revealed God's plan to redeem it. And history itself became the long, unfolding battlefield between those two realities. A struggle still moving forward, still unfinished, still calling every nation, every language, every people to choose whether they will build towers to their own name, or walk humbly into the promise that was spoken before the world was divided. That choice still stands, quietly pressing on every generation, because even after Pentecost, the impulse of Babel did not die. Towers no longer rose from baked bricks and tar, but from ideas, systems, and empires convinced they could secure heaven on their own terms. Power centralized again, names were exalted again. Human confidence dressed itself in new language, but the heart behind it remained unchanged. Babel learned to wear different masks. The message that spread from Jerusalem, moved outward into the very nations once scattered in judgment. It entered Rome, the ultimate empire, iron-strong, disciplined, ruthless. Rome ruled the world with legions and law, yet it trembled before a message carried by fishermen and former slaves. These believers did not revolt, yet they undermined everything Rome stood for. They refused emperor worship. They rejected false gods. They declared that ultimate authority belonged not to Caesar, but to a crucified and risen king. Rome had towers. Christianity had a cross, and the pattern repeated. Centralized power tried to silence inconvenient truth. Persecution followed belief. Fire, prisons, and executions attempted to crush what could not be controlled. But just as scattering at Babel had multiplied nations, persecution multiplied faith. The more believers were spread, the further the message traveled. Once again, dispersion served God's purpose rather than human pride. Centuries passed. Empires shifted. Rome fell. New powers rose in the same ancient regions. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. Old lands carried new banners, new languages, new claims to authority. Yet the deeper conflict remained unchanged. Who defines truth? Who receives allegiance? Who is worshipped? That the descendants of Shem and Ham continued to intersect, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through uneasy coexistence. Sacred memory fractured, stories diverged, prophets were remembered differently. Revelation itself became a dividing line rather than a bridge. Where one tradition traced promise forward, another emphasized law, lineage, or power. The nations born from Babel did not merely speak different languages anymore. They told different versions of meaning itself. Still, Scripture insists that history is not drifting. The scattering of nations was never meant to be permanent. The confusion of tongues was never meant to be the final state of humanity. From Genesis to the prophets, from the Gospels to Revelation, the direction remains consistent. Gathering, restoration, a kingdom not defined by borders, ethnicity, or imperial force, but by truth and submission to God. The final vision is not of one language erased, but of many languages unified, not of cultures destroyed, but redeemed, not of a tower reaching heaven, but heaven descending to earth. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation stand together, not confused, not competing, not exalting their own name, but proclaiming one. No, and that brings the story full circle. What began with dishonor in a tent revealed the human heart. What rose at Babel exposed human ambition. What unfolded through empires displayed human power. But what ends the story is not humanity's achievement. It is God's promise kept. The flood did not end humanity. Babel did not end unity. Exiles did not end covenant. Even the cross did not end the plan. It sealed it. History, then, is not random movement. It is moral direction. Every generation inherits the same crossroads Noah's sons faced, the same choice Babel's builders made. Abram, will we expose or cover? Will we exalt ourselves or trust God? Will we build upward in pride or walk forward in obedience? And that is where the story now leaves us. Not at the beginning of another empire, not at the base of another tower, but at a moment of decision. Bands, from a vineyard after the flood to a tower on the plains of Shinar, from the rise of empires to the scattering of nations, Scripture presents history as more than a record of events. It is a mirror. It shows us what humanity does when given unity without humility, power without submission, knowledge without obedience. Again and again, the pattern is the same. When people seek to make a name for themselves, confusion follows. When they refuse God's command, division multiplies. Yet woven through every failure is a promise that never breaks. God did not abandon humanity after the flood. He did not destroy the nations after Babel. He did not erase Israel after exile. And he has not withdrawn his call from the world today. The division of languages was an act of restraint, not rejection. The scattering of peoples was a pause, not an ending. Every step of judgment carried within it the seeds of mercy. Banjist, the Bible's message is clear. History is moving somewhere. It is not circling endlessly, and it is not spiraling out of control. It is advancing toward restoration. The same God who scattered the nations is the God who will gather them. The same voice that confused language is the voice that will one day be understood by every tongue, not through human achievement, but through divine. And in the end, the question is not about towers or tribes, curses or empires. It is about allegiance. Whose name will be lifted? Whose word will be trusted? Whose kingdom will stand when every structure built by human pride finally falls?